to bring the question of loyalty to Christ a little closer to home, how do we express our loyalty to Christ when we interact with other Christians, especially if we're convinced that they have some error in their teaching?
Well, Chris, it's important to distinguish between the kinds of issues that we would disagree on. I think it's very important to keep clear on the person and the nature of who God is, the person and nature, the person and work of His Son, and you start messing with this delicate articulation of His being 100% divine and 100% human. That's really important to go to the mat for. And then when you talk about His the need to the importance of understanding that salvation is about what He did for us and not what we can do for ourselves, and the absolute authority of God's Word. Those are matters where we need to stay very firm. And yet we also have to recognize that there are other kinds of issues where we're just going to have to extend some grace to each other and recognize that it's really possible for people who are trying to be obedient and trying to be submissive to God's Word to come to some different conclusions, and to recognize that in the history of the church, the conversation has gone on and will continue to go on about things like, well, how old should a person be when they get baptized? Mm-hmm. And should water be put on them, or should they be put under the water? Questions about how we should govern the churches, whether to govern churches more hierarchically, more democratically, or some sort of compromise. Matters like, well, even the conversation over how do we understand or unpack the mystery of the fact that God's totally in charge, and yet we are also responsible for making decisions. And we've just got to lean into the importance of the central truths and find ways to become passionately and wholeheartedly persuaded on matters that are not central, but also factor in the fact that other brothers and sisters are going to come down differently, and somehow we have to learn to love one another, listen to one another, and serve one another with those differences. And if we have anything to offer to the world, it is this ability to love one another on the basis of a common creed, a common faith, a common person, and just because of His love for us and for one another, we learn to defer to each other and care about each other, even though we're going to differ with some things. And if I may, I think that in Richard Pratt's lessons on building your theology, he has some great things to say about thinking less in binary terms on some issues and thinking more in analog terms, where there are degrees of how certain you can be about some things. Some things you can be really certain about, and other things not so certain about. And thinking in terms of a cone of certainty, thinking about putting central truths at the center of things and more peripheral things on the outside, and then sort of developing a scale for how you assess those things. Richard has some great things to say, some very helpful things to say. It's in Building Your Theology, the third lesson.